Well, thanks, Madhu, for inviting me, and I'm really pleased to be talking with all of you about our health system research agenda. I'll just call it the Learning Health System Research Agenda. And in my talk today, I'm going to give you an overview of a variety of different initiatives that we've been involved in over the last several years to implement the Learning Health System model that is focused on building communities of people galvanized around a common purpose. In our case, it's improving the health and lives of children. Using data, clinical data, to improve care and also conduct research, using quality improvement methods in order to make care more reliable, and research in routine care settings. Those are the four components: communities, data, standardized data that can be repurposed for quality improvement, and research. It's a hard kind of system to build, but as I said to Madhu over lunchtime, I think when we started this work about 10 years ago, not many health system leaders were listening to us. But today, with the convergence of quality and costs around value, the realization that you can't optimize one part of your system, you have to simultaneously optimize multiple parts, care, costs, and quality, we're starting to see CFOs, CEOs, and chief medical officers knocking on our door, probably knocking on your door as well. So let me share with you our work, and then we'll open up for discussion on any part of what I have to say at the end. About 7 years ago, I participated in a series of panels at the Institute of Medicine to develop the concept of the learning health system. And it was a very ethereal kind of concept outlined in a number of reports, about 12 reports now. Mike McGinnis has spearheaded this work at the IOM. It's ethereal because it is highly conceptual. If you read one of these reports, it talks about patients and providers working together to improve shared decision-making using the best possible evidence, where discovery is a natural outgrowth of routine care, and all of this is occurring in real time. What we realized is that in order to go from that concept to something real, we needed to build a prototype. And this wasn't a realization I came across because I really liked talking to people about the conceptual basis of the learning health system until one day when I was explaining this to our chief surgeon, he just said to me, "Chris, I'm a simple surgeon. I have no idea what you're talking about. I cut through the skin, I cut through the fat, I cut through the fascia, step by step by step. How do you build one of these things?" So it was a good point. We wrote a grant to the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, received a $12 million grant to build a prototype learning health system with pediatric gastroenterologists around the country, Improve Care Now. I'll share some of that work with you. Improve Care Now now includes 40% of the nation's pediatric gastroenterologists who are working together to improve care, engaging patients, engaging each other, and engaging systems leaders. We built that prototype, and then about a year and a half ago, we worked, actually more than that now, 2 years ago, we worked with a number of children's hospitals, 25 children's hospitals, selected 8 to spearhead a new national network we call Peasnet, which is creating a national pediatric learning health system, and I'll talk to you about that as well. So this journey from concept to prototype to scaling, if you're interested in it, we talk about that in a paper we wrote back in July's Health Affairs. This is the model we use, the learning cycle model. We sort of don't like using the words quality and research as separate things, although they have separate conceptual bases in some respects and separate types of knowledge networks that they draw from. We like to think about the learning cycle, where there's a continuous, virtuous cycle in which you're constantly learning from patients and clinicians, where at the point of care, we call that the learning engine, where the patients and clinicians are coming together, making decisions, and a learning health system captures those data in a structured way so that they can be repurposed for the afferent arm. I'm going to use my neurology now, the afferent arm, which is generating new knowledge, conducting research about what the best approach for a particular kind of care process might be, what is the best medication, what is the best delivery model, et cetera, generating new knowledge and then driving that new knowledge back into the point of care using quality improvement. So the concept of learning, we think, includes building communities, capturing data, generating knowledge from the routine care settings, and then bringing it back to the point of care through quality improvement. And this is the framework, this is the model, really, that we're using to build a number of learning health systems all over the country. So just to drive the point home, learning health systems comprise communities first and foremost. You will be unsuccessful if you just try to take a big data approach to this topic. You've got to start with the social, building relationships, bringing people together around a common purpose. And that's what we did. That's what we did in pediatrics. That's what we did in gastroenterology. In 2008, 8 practices participated in Improved Care Now. By 2015, we have nearly 80 practices participating in Improved Care Now, paying to play, paying to participate. We have 8 vanguard institutions in Peasnet, but we have about 25 others that are now developing the standardization that's required to be part of Peasnet, built and largely building around a common purpose of improving the health and health care of children. Learning health systems create big data resources, and I'll show you some of that in a sec, that enable you to do both research and quality. So this is my main take-home message, I think, today is what is a learning health system? It's these 4 components. So let's talk about the reusable data piece. It became very apparent when we first got into this work that we had a highly inefficient way of capturing data at the point of care. Conventional registries had data in 3 times, right? So you have the encounter where you collect data, and then someone abstracts that data onto a case report form, and then somebody enters that data into the computer. Even today with electronic health records, most registries have data collected 3 times, a highly inefficient, error-prone system. We went to Madison, Wisconsin, and met with the leadership of Epic, and we said, listen, you have a lot of clients out there who are entering data 3 times. We know that you're interested in registries. They told us that they were very interested in registries, and we said, why not work with us to create a reusable form that can be used by pediatric gastroenterologists to capture in a standardized way, in a highly reliable way, what's happening during the visit. So this is the case report form for Improved Care Now that's embedded now within Epic. And the applications that the Epic programmers developed in order to generate this are part of the system, so that these registry forms can be developed on the fly, if you will, by information services groups. So the data are captured in the same way across institutions, and they're stored with the same formats and the same standards, which is very important for combining data. In Peasnet, we have collected now data on 4.5 million children across the country. The way in which we're collecting is we're extracting data from the electronic health records. We're using ETL code to transform that to a common data model that we've developed in Peasnet based on the OMOP data model. If anybody's interested, I can talk about that further. But we're also linking the EHR data to health plan data, patient-reported outcome data, clinical registries. We have a project linking it to birth records. And then we're linking our network to other patient-powered research networks and also CTSA infrastructures that are common with our pediatric institutions. All of that gets stored in a data coordinating center that allows you to query the data in real time. So we have a desktop program that allows you to access the data and slice and dice it the way you would like to across 4.5 million, or you can output, after you've written a protocol and a proposal, a patient-level data set. And then there's also the possibility of using these data to identify patients who meet certain criteria, sending those encrypted identifiers, because this is all de-identified, back to the local institutions and recruiting them for clinical trials. If you're interested in this model, if you want more information on it, we published an article in 2014 in JAMIA that describes our architecture for Peasnet. So let's turn our attention now to improving outcomes with no new drugs. What I think we learned through the informatics work is that it's possible to standardize data and standardize it in a way that you can combine it and reuse it for quality improvement as well as research. This is the story of Improved Care Now that started, again, with 8 practices and now has grown to 80. And the gastroenterologists that came together initially with funding from the American Board of Pediatrics started with this idea. We're a group of pediatric gastroenterologists, and we know that in order for us to have an impact, we need to start with what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve. This is outcomes-driven healthcare. It took them not 1 month, 6 months to agree on an outcome that was the common outcome that they were trying to achieve in children with inflammatory bowel disease, and that is disease activity. So once the outcome was defined, the gastroenterologist created a registry that collected the outcome data, and they created a logic model of primary and secondary drivers that are processes of care that could be focused on to improve the outcome. They built community, focusing on the outcome that's common purpose of improving the health and lives of children with inflammatory bowel disease. They began to build a registry. We ultimately worked with Epic to make more effective use of technology. We share everything through a commons. We call it the pediatric commons. We make all of our resources, whether they're technical, scientific, or governance resources, rapidly available. And then we've begun to bring people together with these different disciplinary backgrounds, and we're calling it now learning system sciences. So individuals with these backgrounds now, in one way or another, relate to both Peasnet as well as Improved Care Now. Each patient who is seen by a gastroenterologist has their data entered through the electronic health record, or through, if they are a practice that is not on Epic or they don't have even an EHR, you can enter directly through a standard web-based portal. And what you get back is a pre-visit report for every patient you're about to see that brings data forward. That's useful information about the patient's status. Here's information about each one of their visits, what is their disease activity, in a variety of labs, and then this can be charted. And then there's also decision support embedded in here, so that if somebody's being underdosed, which is a common problem with pediatric gastroenterology, that gets alerted before the visit. Many practices use these pre-visit reports before they see the patients sitting around with their teams to talk about the patients and what needs to be done. Yeah, sure, question.
Before you actually get into the data part, could you talk a little bit about the process by which it took more than 1 month, but 6 months to get the community to actually agree on what the outcome would be?
Yeah, so we call these design meetings, where we bring people together in a common place. We like to say that fraternities figured this a long time ago, that if you set the bar high to get into the club, people tend to stay in the club. And so we set the bar fairly high. You've got to pay your way to some location, often on a Saturday and a Sunday. You've got to bring your ideas. You've got to do preparatory work. And we use a variety of sort of structured kinds of discussions to get people to talk about, for, in this case, inflammatory bowel disease patients, what are you trying to accomplish? And it's very hard, because typically people will focus on the care as opposed to the outcomes. So we let the conversation flow, and then we elaborate all of the possible outcomes kind of in an open-ended way, eliciting them. And then bring it back to the clinicians, usually in teleconferences, and calibrate on the most important. Because there's not really one, right? Some gastroenterologists said the real outcome we're trying to achieve is functioning, is a kid being able to participate fully with their friends and at school, which is important and is probably downstream from disease activity. So we needed to figure out what are the outcomes that were more proximal to what we're doing as physicians. What are the outcomes that we can measure? It's a little hard to measure peer relationships. What are the ones that will be most, which will change most rapidly with respect to our care management initiatives? So it's an interaction between QI specialists, outcomes people, and clinicians, figuring out what's measurable and what makes sense from a clinical perspective. So there's not a real roadmap, but there's a series of meetings where we try to, at the end, agree on an outcome that we can manage to.
I was just curious if there was a particular, people use different kinds of approaches to get consensus, and whether you found one being more effective in your group than others.
It's so highly variable. We've done this with a number of groups now. We've been working really hard, for example, with developmental pediatricians with ADHD, trying to figure out what the right outcomes are there, autism. We have another network of individuals focusing on children with obesity. So the methods for each one of these groups are highly variable, because it kind of have to adapt to their culture. So thanks for that question. So this are the pre-visit reports. In addition, clinicians get population management reports where they get to view their entire practice. Here we're looking at a practice report where you're looking at the percentage of patients with Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, indeterminate, the remission status of your patients, and then you can drill down into any one of these and look at individual patient information. You can output which patients are not in remission. So here we're looking at people who should be seen more frequently, who have a higher disease activity. So you may use a different model of care for the people who have higher disease activity than for kids who are more quiescent. And in fact, the gastroenterologists have developed care pathways that are linked to the disease activity level of the individuals. Using those pre-visit planning approaches, population management, talking with other gastroenterologists on a weekly basis about what's working, what's not working, creating bundles of care where 5 or 6 things that we can all agree on should be done in every patient, and then implementing them in a highly reliable way, and providing feedback to clinicians on a monthly basis for, regarding what they're doing. Since the launch of the network in 2007, we started measuring remission rates, which is no disease activity. The kids feel great. Some kids talk about forgetting that they have inflammatory bowel disease. And we've monitored on a monthly basis. Each one of these circles is a month. And you can see that the remission rates with no new medications have gone from 50% to nearly 80%. And 40% of kids now in the country are being exposed to this new innovation. No new medications, no new biologics. It's using the same medicines, the same armamentarium in 2014 that we had in 2007. And so I like to say that if this were Pfizer, this would be a billion-dollar blockbuster drug, and it's quality improvement. Next, I'd like to talk to you about using EHR data to change care using clinical decision support. And so we, at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, we have a large network of primary care physicians, about 35 practices now. We have about 15 specialty practices. We see about 1.6% of all patient visits made by children are made in our system in the country, 1.6% of all children, of all visits in the country. And so we got interested in using a decision support framework that's sort of complex. I can explain it to you a little bit, and I'll show you some examples. It's not embedded within Epic. It interfaces with Epic, and I'll explain that in a sec. And we wanted to use it to embed right at the point of care real-time decision support that implemented the Academy of Pediatrics, the Academy of Family Physicians, guidelines for high-quality otitis media care. We wanted to contrast that decision support with simple retrospective monthly feedback reports using EHR data, and then evaluate the impact of both together or singly on otitis media care. So this is the study setting. Here we are. Each one of these little things is a practice, whether it's a star or it's a square or a circle. This is the system, the CHOP system. It's in 3 states: Delaware, southern New Jersey, southeast Pennsylvania. In this study, 24 practices agreed to participate. That's about 300 physicians, 185,000 patients met our criteria. We used a cluster randomized trial design where we randomized the practices to decision support or control. You can see it's a 2-to-1 ratio here. And then within each of these groups, we further randomized those practices to either feedback or no feedback. We didn't think individual level, patient level randomization was feasible because of contamination that could occur within the practice. We evaluated otitis media care before randomization, so we have a sort of a pre-randomization period, and then we evaluated afterwards for 10 months with just decision support. We then also introduced feedback on a monthly basis, and we ended it after about 2.5 years. This is the decision support screenshots. Essentially what the decision support does is when a certain set of criteria, it's about 35 lines of code. It's a very short amount of code that get embedded into Epic. When those criteria embedded in this code are met, the patient has a diagnosis of otitis media, the patient may have called up and spoke with a nurse about ear pain, the patient has a reason for encounter that relates to otitis media. Whenever any of those criteria are met, a signal gets sent out of Epic to another server through the APIs that are part of the Epic system. The data that are in the other server are then aggregated. We have all the patient's data from the last 5 or 6 years sitting in the server. All of their data are aggregated so that you get this view back of their prior otitis media care. So what happens, just one more time, is the signal goes out, the server sits over here, it aggregates the data for the patients, and then it sends it back into Epic, which is an HTML browser. It's like Amazon.com. When you hit a button on Amazon.com, that's an HTML browser, you're going somewhere else, some application's being run, and then you're sent back a screen based on whatever application you launched. And that's what's happening here. So this is actually a framework that could be used across the country because all EHRs are basically HTML browsers, and you can send information back as HTML files. So that's what this is. It's an HTML file. So what you're looking at here is the otitis media history. So here's a calendar. Each one of these letters is a different episode of care. You can see that we've sort of bolded how long the episodes last. In this case, bilateral otitis media lasted for several months. You can see the medications that were prescribed. You can see the office visits that the patient had, et cetera. And if you click on any of these, you go to that part of the record in the EHR that has that information. So if you want to know what happened at this office visit, you just click on that circle and you pop into that office visit in the electronic health record. This summarizes about seven different screens in Epic. So it would literally take you about a half hour as a clinician to get all this information. It's a good medical student activity, but not a good physician activity. So this you get for free. Once patients come in for otitis media, you get this, and the physicians absolutely love this. We designed this with physicians. We actually designed it with somebody who is a human computer interaction specialist who understands how people interact with a computer, where they tend to look. And he used those principles and how people interact with computers in a lab with clinicians and iterated. This took him about 4 or 5 months to actually end up to build this. So they loved it. They loved it in the lab. Once they launched it, they just clicked the history, and then they have all these findings, and their little eyes allowed the clinicians to show pictures to medical students. Actually loved it a lot because they could see what a bulging tympanic membrane looked like, what an injected tympanic membrane looked like. This one's a bulging tympanic membrane. We also had videos that showed how the eardrum moved as education tools. Once you did the history and physical, then you hit a button, and here comes the diagnosis completed for you. You can accept or decline the treatments, both analgesia, antibiotics, and the appropriate dose, weight-based dosing. And then as you proceed, it writes your note, and it facilitates your orders. It pulls an order set for you, writes your progress note, generates customized, personalized patient instructions, et cetera. So we just thought we had built the best thing since sliced bread. Yes?
This is fabulous. What was the outcome?
I'm about to show you that.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah. Yeah.
It's easier.
Yeah, that was the idea. I have a friend who says, Chris, make it easier for me. I only have so many clicks in life.
This is super in itself, but it had to have an outcome, right?
It's going to have an outcome.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the punchline. So we made it so that it had fewer clicks. And here are the quality metrics. You can see these are metrics that you could not obtain by using administrative data. They required us to actually look at some of the text as well as the structured data. So here's an example of a high-dose amoxicillin quality measure. You first have to find people with acute otitis media, looking at both diagnoses as well as the physical exam and the history. So it's actually very tricky to figure out who's got a particular clinical phenotype in an electronic health record.
Is that natural language processing?
No, we weren't using natural language processing. We weren't learning. Because it was a fairly simple problem, we were able to use text strings. So we would look for things like bulging TM, but all variations on that. And so on. So you can see the way this was defined, highly clinical, somewhat difficult approach for defining quality metrics. using EHR. So here are the results. This is the decision support effect, and I'm going to show you the feedback effect. So here's some quality metrics along here, the number of visits there, and here is the this is the follow-up period, the first few months, 3 months to 20 months. So these are just intercept changes. So what we asked is, did the percent of people who treated pain with Tylenol or ibuprofen change before versus after? That's the intercept effect. Was it just a change? And what was that ratio? That's the odds ratio, the adjusted odds ratio. And then we said, okay, did they change and did they tend to get better or did they tend to get worse? And that would be the slope. So things above 1 with significant p-values suggest that there was a positive effect. So more likely, these physicians were more likely to assess pain, to treat that pain with Tylenol and ibuprofen, to adequately document diagnosis, to confirm diagnosis of otitis media with effusion with pneumatic otoscopy. And also there were basically all of the quality indicators, there were 10 of them, moved in the right direction. Here's the feedback effect. So this is just physicians receiving on a monthly basis a report of how well they did on these quality metrics compared with physicians in their practice and physicians in their network. As one physician said, when we brought the feedback reports back to her office, 85%, I've never had a B in my life. And so it was a highly motivating approach just to show people how they contrasted to their peers. So here we see that even with feedback, there's a positive effect. And when we added the effect of decision support to feedback, it wasn't additive. And if you want to read about this, we wrote this up in Pediatrics. The take-home message in terms of whether this worked or not is that I believe the feedback was just as effective as that fancy decision support. This is a lot cheaper. It's a lot simpler. It allowed physicians, when we provided the feedback, they could look at how they contrasted, and they also were given a link to the patients who were used for that report. So they could click on that link and then look at at what they did. So I missed these patients, what happened? And they could go back and learn. And that was a very effective approach. We also found that if that was all, by the way, what's called intention to treat analysis. And then if you look at, if you use the decision support tool, were you better? And of course, these are positive ratios. So no surprise that if you use the tool, you did better. But this is, to me, the most interesting finding. X-axis is the study period. Y-axis is the percent of visits that were eligible to use the tool that actually where the physicians used it. a lot of interest in the beginning. There was that intercept effect, and then it just dropped down to 18%. And my colleague Alex Fix has written an article in Health Services Research talking about why physicians adopt versus don't adopt technology. And without data, what I can say is that what we've learned is that when you bring a piece of technology like decision support into a physician's practice, into a culture, if you don't wrap that around with culture change or with quality improvement, that's the culture change I'm really talking about. If you don't start with quality improvement and sensitize people to the change that may come with decision support, even if you build the Tesla of decision support, which is what I think we got, people won't use it because it's not consistent with their workflow, it's not consistent with what they value, and so you see this kind of low usage. This is about $1 million to do this project.
But how did it change the amount of time? Because you talked about how there was less clicking involved. And
yes.
So theoretically it should have been quicker. And if you're calculating value to include cost in terms of productivity and time, that would enter into your equation.
So thanks for that question. So how did the decision support system change the time equation? All right, so in the lab, markedly, like 80% reduction in the amount of time it took to do one of these visits, right? In real life, who comes in with just otitis media, right? So if somebody comes in with an ear infection plus a cold, an ear infection plus a throat infection, or ear infection or any other problem, they could use the decision support, but then they have to go off into another part of the record. And people love treating otitis media because it's so easy. they think it's easy. You know, what we found is that there's a lot of, I'm not going to show you all the variability that exists across these practices, but we had some practices 10% on a quality marker, all the way up to practices at 90%. Huge variation in the way antibiotics are prescribed. But it's an easy visit. It's a 4-minute visit. It's a 5-minute visit. So the workflows were already well embedded. Since we hadn't brought improvement into the practices first, they weren't ready to change. There was no interest. The people who changed are the people who love computers. They just thought it was the coolest thing.
And the feedback's effect on reducing overuse?
So that was the biggest effect, is reducing overuse of second and third generation cephalosporins and more use of first-line therapy like amoxicillin, more use of pain treatment as well. That was the biggest effect. It was really interesting to see how few physicians were prescribing pain medications, which is actually the primary treatment for otitis media. Yeah.
So your outcome results, when you're saying only 18% used it, is it because it's randomized, it's getting evened out, or is your result only on 80%?
Those are among the people who were exposed to the decision support.
So only on 18% of your data, your outcome is positive.
Well, if the outcome is use, right? So we use an intention to treat analysis. So we saw for the population there was better care overall, but the tool was only being used 18% of the time.
Okay, got it.
It was consistent. It was consistently bad. I just love failure. All right, so now I want to turn our attention to, we've talked a bit about quality improvement on learning systems. We've talked about the data. Let's talk about how you can use the data for observational comparative effectiveness research. So again, working with the gastroenterologists, we recognized a problem. The problem is that we had no data on the effectiveness of biologic therapy. Back in 1993, the first report on Infliximab, which is an anti-TNF inhibitor, was issued. This is a very powerful drug that's now used for a number of autoimmune diseases. First discovered in 1993. 5 years later, the FDA approves Remicade, which is Infliximab, that's the trade name, for treatment of Crohn's disease. 14 years after its discovery, the first pediatric trial was done, but there was no comparison group. It was an efficacy study. It was called REACH. It was 112 children, and they all started Infliximab, and they were followed for a year, and the question was, did they go into remission? No comparison, no contrast. And up until the study I'm about to show you, we had no idea whether or not if you gave Infliximab versus conventional treatment, it had a beneficial effect. So we knew this issue about REACH was only a single group, and we also knew that some patients who were really sick, which is when you start Infliximab, they'll get better on their own without any treatment. So we needed to find kids who start Infliximab and are sick, and then don't start Infliximab and are sick. And we said, why not use our existing data that we've been collecting for years to answer this question in an observational way? So we conceptualized the data as a series of trials, naturally occurring trials. And each one of these is a patient. So here's a patient, boom, it's got moderately severe disease, not so bad here, and they start biologics, and then they get followed in an observational, naturalistic way. And a few other patients. Here are patients who, boom, are sick, moderately severely ill, but they don't get biologics. Right? So calendar time down here, we take all those patients, and we say, okay, let's look at them as though we were doing a 6-month trial. And so we'll set time 0 to when they first became ill with moderate to severe level of disease activity. So that's the analytic structure of our pseudo trials. And then we contrasted the groups. So here are the people who started biologics up on top. Here are the kids who didn't start biologics. We contrasted them in the probability that they would go from being moderately severe to in remission. In remission means low disease activity. I feel great. I'm going over to my friend's house. I'm having fun. And we found that the rate ratio for these two groups was 1.5. So 50% more likely to go into remission if you start Infliximab versus if you don't. And then the gastroenterologists were interested in remission without receiving another medication, steroids, and that rate ratio was a lot higher. It turns out that these rate ratios are exactly the same in a randomized controlled trial done with adults called SONIC, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Exactly the same. Same effect sizes. We spent about $40,000, and Sonic spent, I think, a lot more to generate those effects. That observational study we did fairly quickly. We used that pseudo-trial methodology that was first developed by Miguel Hernan at Harvard, and now we've just received a couple of weeks ago an $8 million grant to further our understanding of how to use anti-TNF therapy based on that work, where we're going to randomize 450 patients who are moderately severely ill, starting anti-TNF to receive either methotrexate or placebo, because there's a thought that the addition of a second drug will increase the effectiveness of anti-TNF. We're collecting data as per usual when the patients come back, as per their gastroenterologist decisions and their decisions and when they should be seen. We are not following a protocol. This is called a pragmatic clinical trial, but it's randomized and it's placebo-controlled and masked. We're also collecting from all the patients, in addition to measures of disease activity, measures of patient-reported outcomes, what we call experienced well-being. That's kind of a concept that has emerged in the subjective well-being literature that has the notions of suffering, the level of pain, fatigue, and emotional distress that you experience, as well as how happy you are. So my team, we're not going to talk about it today, but we do a lot of work developing patient-reported outcomes for children, and we'll be testing some of those in this trial. So that's a bit on the observational research leading to clinical trials. And then in conclusion, I want to just end with my launching of Peasnet. I mentioned Peasnet earlier. Peasnet is a national network that's trying to scale the Improve Care Now GI learning health system to all conditions and all children across the country. We're funded by PCORI. We received $16 million of infrastructure funding. We're part of PCORNet, which includes 11 different clinical data research networks. You're part of one of those here at Sinai. Renu Kaushal is, where are you? Hey, there you are. That's an easy one to understand. So Renu Kaushal is the principal investigator. George Ripchak is your informatician. New York City CDRN, Clinical Data Research Network, is really quite interesting because the concept here is to standardize data across the city, across all healthcare institutions. That's the concept. What we're doing is standardizing data to create, well, let me just mention our purpose, because this, I would be remiss if I didn't say this, is this is a purpose statement developed by our board of trustees. We don't have board of trustees, we call them the steering board. No, not the stakeholders, the steering board. They're department chairs, CEOs, parents who get votes on what happens with Peasnet. And we've chosen C-suite and leaders and parents to lead Peasnet because we think ultimately Peasnet is going to be embedded into the health systems and paid for by the health systems. That this idea of using electronic health record data to improve care and conduct research is going to become business as usual. So here are the vanguard institutions, these 8 were chosen from 25 based on a number of factors, but a big one was their informatics expertise. CHOP, St. Louis, Boston Children's, Cincinnati, Seattle Children's, Nationwide in Columbus, Ohio, Colorado Children's, and then Nemours, which has locations in Wilmington and Orlando. We're connecting particularly our data networks to the CTSAs. We have a number of relationships with other clinical data research networks, particularly focused on children. Ours is the only one that is exclusively focused on children and adolescents. We connect with networks outside of PCORNet, like SBS, which is a large children's hospital safety network. We receive funding from a number of sponsors. I'm not sure why NSF is there. We haven't received NSF funding yet, but we hope to. And then we're also linking our data to health plans, pharmacy benefit management companies, and data aggregators so that when we have a child's electronic health record from CHOP, we also should have their administrative data so we know if they were hospitalized at a different institution. Okay, this is the geographic distribution of Peasnet, and we have other. As I said, there are about 20 other institutions that are now adopting different elements of Peasnet. Where you see the darker counties, that's where we have the most patients. Peasnet has now aggregated data for 4.5 million children from 2009 to 2014. These are longitudinal records of children. And what we're doing is we're standardizing data to a common data model that's pediatric specific. We use the OMOP data model. It's compatible with the other 10 clinical data research networks. We have a way of encrypting patient identifiers so that we can link data between electronic health records and health plans. We also are able to use our data resource to recruit patients, which I mentioned before. Here's an example of a little report that our informatics team produced in 30 minutes. One of the networks that we work with is the Pediatric Rheumatology Network, and they wanted to know how many patients in the Peasnet data network have all of these different conditions. And these are all fairly rare conditions. So, and we're showing the female-male distribution, counts on the y-axis, age on the x-axis. So the query was done to identify these patients very quick. It was sort of point and shoot is the way our application works. A data set was outputted, and then we just fed it into R and ran this report in 30 minutes. We have a single IRB approach where each institution's IRBs have negotiated a master reliance agreement that sets the terms and conditions for a single IRB so that, let's say, Sinai signs on to that. If a Sinai investigator is a principal investigator, Sinai IRB becomes the IRB of record, and we've set up the terms and conditions for reliance, and we also have standardized the reliance process and the reliance form so that we can move an application through the IRB review across multiple institutions very quickly. We have a number of studies, some of which have already been funded, that we've launched through it's 8 within Peasnet. We have a couple of others that are outside of Peasnet. A study on bariatric surgery, a study on the effects of antibiotics on children's growth. And as I said before, we're starting to write grants with CTSAs to link the two types of infrastructures. But most importantly, Peasnet is about relationships. And this, as I said before, learning health systems have 4 parts. I would suggest the most important part is the relationships that are built. Building relationships with clinicians, building relationships with C-suite individuals, finding the value proposition that's common across your stakeholders so that there's a shared sense of ownership over the resource. We engage parents very specifically at all aspects of our system. We give parents the opportunity to participate in studies. We give parents the opportunity to contribute by leading committees. And we give parents the opportunity to serve in a governance role with voting rights on our steering board. And that's that framework I just described is listed there below. So in sum, I think the learning health system model has a lot to offer health systems, particularly academic medical systems, because it links investments in electronic health records and other e-data resources to quality improvement and research. It then creates a culture of learning where you're constantly trying to improve the outcome through research and quality improvement, as well as informatics applications. And I see it's kind of a coalescence of what C-suite executives are dealing with around value-based healthcare and what we as health system researchers are trying to achieve as well. And that is improving the health and lowering the costs of populations that we care deeply about. So thanks very much for your attention.
How'd you pull off getting a single IRB?
So, yeah. So we actually, one of the things that we try to do in Peasnet is build relationships. So I talked with each IRB chair, and we have a team at each one of the institutions. They warmed them up. We talked with them. We have a regulatory work group. The IRB chairs started working together, and they wrote it, not us. They wrote it. They own it. They reviewed it. They went to their council, and they all signed it. Now that one master reliance agreement has been signed by 20 other pediatric institutions, they were so proud that they worked together that they took it to, I don't actually remember the name of the meeting, but there's a national meeting of like IRB chairs, and they took it there and presented it to other children's hospitals who signed on. So that agreement will facilitate not only Peasnet studies, but any work, because multi-institutional work is so prevalent now. the bigger coup was to get the lawyers to agree with one another. And so we have a common data use agreement with common terms for limitations of liability that they all signed on to. We also require a certain level of cyber insurance. And the way we were able to get the lawyers to talk with one another is through the investigators and through the department chairs and the CEOs. So when the lawyers started hearing it from them, they were willing to come together.
What's the variability of EMR systems among your participants?
Depends on how you define the participants, because the Peasnet is the 8, and then we also link with a number of these disease-specific networks. So Epic accounts for about 65% of pediatric business and growing. 65, soon to be probably around 75%. We're seeing a number of institutions that had other systems moving to Epic, but in our network in Peasnet is 6 on Epic, 2 on other systems, 1 on Cerner, 1 on Allscripts.
Any interchange issues coming up
The interchange
between vendors?
Yeah, so we talk with everybody. They talk with themselves, but it's clear that you have to build middleware that sits above the EHR. Even in your own institution, because CIOs like to get things implemented, decisions are often made that may limit the amount of standardization that occurs, because people want things defined in their own way. So you might have cyanosis defined by a pediatric cardiologist that's different from a cardiothoracic surgeon, because the idea was to get the forms up for them. So what we do is we've created a data model that defines the structures and the semantics based on national terminologies like ICD, SNOMED, LOINC, and RxNorm for diagnoses, labs, and medications. We embed those terminologies in our data model, and we require that institutions take their source data, transform it, and then load it into that data model, and then we combine it. And so to become part of Peasnet, you have to agree to be not only a single IRB person, cyber insurance, agree to our governance and our policies, but also agree to standardize your data. And there are a number of institutions that are doing that now on their own dime.
So Chris, I have a question. Given that you had engaged the stakeholders so well, the 18% use of CDS, how do we improve on that?
So if I were to do it again,
Yes.
I wouldn't have chosen Otitis Media. I would, first of all, I would have embedded it within existing quality improvement structures that we already have in the primary care system. And I would work with the primary care doctors to defining the problem that they thought that was most important for them to address. So it turns out, after that failure, success and failure, we did approach the primary care docs again, and the most important problem for them was ADHD. So we've now built other decision support systems to help with ADHD care, particularly around shared decision making, setting goals, and helping people achieve their goals. So I would say you've got to change culture first, or take advantage of existing networks and existing infrastructure to get buy-in to a new technology.
But you won't move towards hard stop kind of an idea that you have to use it if I have the decision support in the system? Would
That would
work?
cause mass rebellion. I mean, you can make those decisions around certain things, but even something as simple as everybody should have a weight and height at every visit, so we can compute BMI.
Yeah.
I only know of one institution that does that, and it's because it was a policy set by the board of trustees.
Yes.
So in that big schema of all the data exchange,
Yeah.
what part is data integrity popping its ugly head?
Oh, it's not a ugly, it's a fun head, you know. But data quality is huge. In fact, our board requires monthly reports on data quality. So when data come in, we have about 700 different data checks that are automated that are done on the data that come in. Data get rejected if they don't meet certain criteria, and then they go back to the institution to remediate the problem. So there are a number of things that you can do to just evaluate the data as they're coming in, but data quality is a funny thing. So we didn't know much about, for example, the Improve Care Now data quality. We knew what the missing data were. We knew that the fields were logical. But were we collecting data that would generate useful information? And that was part of the motivation around that Biologics study that I showed. Can we estimate effect sizes that are similar to what's been done with adults? And if so, we've generated information from our data resource. That's a sense, to me, that's a sense construct validity of the data, which is the highest level. And so I think there needs to be more of this clinical demonstration that data from EHR systems have that kind of capacity. But there's a lot of work that has to go on before you can get to that kind of longitudinal construct validity.
Anything else? Well, Dr. Forrest has a 5 o'clock grand deadline today, and despite that, he took time to present it to us.
Hopefully it's in by now, yeah.
So thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.